Alrighty, welcome to another episode of Ben Buckler Boards. So today we're going to be talking about noisy brakes on your brand new Super73 RX or S2. And to help us out is bicycle legend Thomas from the Rolling Fix.
Hello.
Thomas is also sporting khaki green pants and a black t-shirt, which I think is pretty cool. So we're all ready to do bike mechanics, so stay tuned and find out what happens. So what we've heard from some customers is the brakes on the Super 73 at the front can get a bit squeaky. Say if they've jumped on to an emergency front brake, things have gone a bit haywire and it's making a clunking sound or a noisy or a grating sound. And just wondering what we should do, Thomas, when that happens.
I'll take you through an entire setup of many steps to try and alleviate all the issues. Disc brakes on bikes are often a little bit squeaky or they might not be perfect. So unfortunately there's not one solution that can fix everything. So I'll take you through step by step and hopefully one of these steps will solve your issues. All right, so jump on the bike and we're just gonna grab the front brake, which is generally the right, and we're just gonna rock the bike back and forth. And as we do this, we're gonna try and feel for any major clunking in the bike. So there's naturally going to be a bit of movement in the suspension, and you can see that down here. And we're doing this to see if there's any shaking or anything loose in the headset of the bike, because if there's anything loose, it's going to cause vibrations. And sometimes noises from your brakes is actually a vibration from somewhere else on the bike, and the braking is actually just causing that vibration to make a noise. So by doing this, we can rock it back and forth and make sure that there's nothing majorly loose. Do note there'll always be a little bit of a clunk that is the actual brake pads moving inside the caliper itself. That's okay. So we know there's no movement or no major clunking in the bike, and we're now just going to try and feel the brakes, and you want a nice firm engagement point. You want to feel that both sides are grabbing onto the brake at the same time. If they're a little bit spongy, what that could be is that the caliper could be off center a little bit, and as the two pads move in, they're not clamping the disc evenly. And we want them to clamp the disc evenly because they'll be a lot more powerful, and also it means that there won't be any rubbing when they're not engaged. So this front one feels really good, so does the back one. We'll just jump off the bike now and we're going to move our way down to the front brake. And naturally we've been test riding through this whole process, and you've been seeing if the noises have gone away. First thing we do is a bit tricky, but we're just going to look down the top of the pads here, and we just want to make sure there's a tiny little gap either side. We're just looking down in here, and it's all fine. So there's no major rubbing there. Both pads the pads aren't touching, just in their resting position. So what we're going to do is pop the caliper off and use a Torx T25. So these they're generally not too tight.
So it's worth pointing out too that the brakes in Europe and in Australia are the Magura hydraulic disc brakes.
Yeah, these are a 4-pot design, so there's 4 pistons that move in and out of the calipers. And we're going to look in here now, and you can see you got 4 sets of pads. Each side is actually on the same bed of metal, and we're looking here, we want to see to make sure that the pads are kind of even. Now a little trick that we use is just get a screwdriver and pop it in behind the pad, and you just want to very carefully pop the pistons back on both sides, and that's just going to center everything. And these pads are actually magnetic, so they'll just pop back onto the side there.
Okay.
Interestingly, there is a little bit of rub here. We can see there's been a little bit of grinding on the caliper. So yeah, there's a little bit of rubbing in here. So I think for this bike, that's where the issue is causing.
That's where the noise is coming from.
Yeah, this is where the noise is coming from, because the only part of this whole caliper here that should be touching the disc are these pads. But there's a bit of rub there. So I think that's where the issue is. So I'm just going to clear that off.
And also I was reading that the caliper is actually a heatsink for Magura because they're electric, it's electric bike brakes.
Yep.
The way that caliper is all one piece is designed to disperse the heat.
Yeah, well, the Maguras are really good for these heavier bikes. They've got some of the best braking power and like the ability to get rid of all the heat. You don't really realize how much power is needed to stop an e-bike. Originally, these were for a downhill mountain bike, but now with all the extra weight, they work really well on these beefier bikes. So before we fully tighten this up, we're just going to solve that little scraping issue. We're going to loosen these off. This is a 5mm. And you'll notice there's a bit of movement back and forth here. So what we're going to do, we're going to tighten the bottom one first. And as we do that, it's going to rock the caliper to the back of the bike. Because when we hit the brakes, this is going to grab the disc and this whole caliper is going to want to move forward. So tighten the bottom one first and that will bring everything back. And then we'll do this next one. And now that they're tight, we're going to tighten these back ones. So back to the T25, tighten these a little bit more. Not too tight. And this is where one of the great tricks of centering your brakes comes in. So while that's loose, I'm just going to grab the front brake and this will center the caliper. So you might need to pump it a couple of times to let the fluid all the way down through. So now that's is grabbing the disc. Those pads should be nice and centered. And
so you're squeezing the brake.
Squeezing the lever at the same time. You don't need to squeeze these too tight, but just enough so that both pads move in and grab the disc. So tighten these up. Don't go too tight here. You just want to go a little bit at a time. And just before you fully tighten them, you just want to look down the top here. And I'm looking down, I'm looking at the pads and they look like they're centered. Pick the bike up and they're nice and quiet, there's no rubbing. And now that you've done that, you can go ahead and tighten this a bit more. These don't need to be super tight, just tight enough that the brakes aren't going to vibrate. So now that that's done, take the bike for a test ride, and if it's still making noises, then it might be a time to give a proper bike mechanic a call, or give us a call.
Try again.
Try again, do it all again.
Okay, all right, so I've got a question for Thomas. So, Thomas, we've checked the front brake and the front brake's not making that noise anymore, so that's awesome. What would happen if you got the noise in the back brake? Is it exactly the same process?
It's the same process. You just don't really need to do the rocking back and forth as much. But yeah, you go through it, you could do it all again. You take the caliper off, check everything, make sure there's no rubbing marks or anything like that. But yeah, essentially the rear brake won't give you as much trouble generally, and they're a bit easier to work on. One thing you can always do with the brakes is that if they don't center like we did before, is that you can just tighten it and do it by look. So sometimes you need to do that because there might be some pressure on the brake pad itself or the caliper itself from maybe like a cable could be pushing it in a certain way. But generally the back brake, same process as the front. The back doesn't take anywhere near as much force just because of the way it's designed. But you can see, straight down into the brake, which is easier. And it also only has 2 points here where it tightens, so the chances of it being in the wrong position are a lot lower.
It also looks like too, the way this is designed, if you are braking heavily and there is movement here, that because of this bracket, it's not going to be pushed down onto the rotor.
Correct, yeah, it's not. This is actually trying to take the brake almost like forward and up.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's in a different position. Yeah.
Yeah, so less likely to get noise from that. Okay.
Now, everything we've spoken about today is, a new bike kind of coming out of the box. We're presuming there's no contamination to the brake, that it hasn't been dirtied or anything. So it's one thing to always check is that make sure there's no oil on the brakes. Once you've had your bike and you've ridden it for a bit, one of the most common causes of a noisy brake is contamination. So maybe you've ridden it in the rain, which is fine, but in the puddles you rode through, there might be some oil, and that attaches onto the disc and the brake pads because they're porous, they absorb stuff. And once that oil is in the system, it's very hard to keep your bike quiet. So always just check, and you can just do it with the back of your hand. Make sure the brake is cold and you haven't just been riding it, and just back of your hand, rub it, and there's no oil here. If there is oil, you need to clean the system. So you can do that with a disc brake cleaner, like an acetone kind of thing.
All right. So you would need to clean the rotor. You're saying
The rotor and the pads. So you want to take the pads out, give them all a good clean, and then you're good to go.
Oh, so I didn't realise you can clean pads even though it might have absorbed oil?
Sometimes it's a bit of a. Sometimes it's better just to replace them.
Okay.
Yeah.
We were just saying, I was just chatting to Thomas, and I was saying like, what would happen? Say if one of your pads was worn in the wrong spot and it was causing some noise, what do we do then, Thomas?
So the reason why before we spoke about loosening the caliper off and recentering it is that because it's a heavier bike and because you have a motor, you may not realize if the brakes are rubbing, and if they are rubbing over time, they may wear down they won't be straight. So it means that one side of the brake pad might be fully worn out and the other side might be completely fine. So if that's the case, easiest thing is just to put some new brake pads in, replace them, and then recenter the caliper and just start fresh. If they are really off, they can also kind of cause damage to the disc. However, the discs are pretty robust, so you should be fine unless you get down to metal on metal. But that's it.
All right, good tip. So
Yeah.
I think next time we'll do a video on how to replace the brake pads.
Yeah, replace the brake pads. So if the lever's coming all the way to the brake and you feel like you're not braking, check the brake pads first, but then you also want to look for oil and if there's any leak in the system. So these brakes should get about 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers depending on your weight and how you ride the bike. So if you're in the very early days of your bike and your brakes aren't working, you want to check if there's any oil leaking out of the brakes. So you can check up the top here, you can check anywhere through the system, and you can check down on the caliper. If there is any oil, then that's a moment where you want to take it to a proper mechanic. Otherwise, these are top brakes. They've been around for many years, the Maguras, and if you're going to have some big brakes on your bike, these are the ones to have.
Nice. Thanks, Thomas. Alrighty, that was it. Let us know if you've got any questions in the comments and Thomas will answer them. Awesome to have you here, Thomas. What do you think about the bike?
I think it's pretty good. I think, I'm lucky I've seen these bikes from the early days, like the first bikes they brought out. And I think generation 4 now, we're looking at a very legitimate bike. Everything's, top notch, extremely well engineered, extremely safe, and they look pretty cool as well. There's not much you can really fault on these bikes. Everything's top spec, and I think anyone who gets one is going to have a bike that's going to last a very long time.
Yeah, awesome. All right, thanks, Thomas. Great to have you.
A pleasure. See ya.
See ya.